The Hiding Place. Chapter 10. Scheveningen. A 2-hour drive brought us into the streets of The Hague. The bus stopped in front of a new building. Word was whispered back that this was Gestapo headquarters for all of Holland. We were marched into a large room where the endless process of taking down names, addresses, and occupations began all over again. The chief interrogators I fell on father. That old man, he cried. Did he have to be arrested? Willem led father up to the desk. The Gestapo chief leaned forward. I'd like to send you home, old fellow, he said. I'll take your word that you won't cause any more trouble. I could not see father's face, but I heard his answer. If I go home today, he said evenly and clearly, tomorrow I will open my door again to anyone in need. The amiability drained from the other man's face. Get back in line, he shouted. As we inched along the counter, there were endless repetitions of questions, endless consulting of papers, endless coming and going of officials. It was night when we were marched at last out of the building. We made out the bulk of a large canvas-roofed army truck. 2 soldiers had to lift father over the tailgate. There was no sign of Pickwick. Father, Betsy, and I found places to sit on a narrow bench that ran around the sides. The truck had no springs and bounced roughly over the bomb-pitted streets of The Hague. I slipped my arm behind father's back to keep him from striking the edge. Willem, standing near the back, whispered out what he could see of the blacked-out city. We left the downtown section and seemed to be headed toward the suburb of Scheveningen. It appeared now that our destination was the federal penitentiary. The truck jerked to a halt, and behind us, massive gates clanged shut. We entered an enormous courtyard surrounded by a high brick wall. The truck backed up to a long, low building. Soldiers prodded us inside. I blinked in the white glare of bright ceiling lights. I felt a shove from behind and found myself staring at cracked plaster. I turned my eyes as far as I could, first left and then right. There was Willem. 2 places away from him, Betsy. Next to me on the other side was Toos. All like me, standing with their faces to the wall. Where was father? Then somewhere to the right a door opened. Women prisoners, follow me. As I stepped away from the wall, I glanced swiftly around the room for father. There he was, a few feet from the wall, seated in a straight-backed chair one of the guards had brought him. We started down the long corridor that I could see through the door. But I hung back, gazing desperately at father, Willem, Peter, all our brave underground workers. Father, I cried. God be with you. His head turned toward me. The overhead light flashed from his glasses. And with you, my daughters, he said. I turned and followed the others. Behind me, the door slammed closed. Oh, father, when will I see you next? Betsy's hand slipped around mine. Ahead of us in the corridor was a desk, behind it a woman in uniform. As each prisoner reached this point, she gave her name for the 1000th time that day and placed on the desk whatever she was wearing of value. Noli, Betsy, and I unstrapped our beautiful wristwatches. The officer pointed to the simple gold ring that had belonged to Mama. I wriggled it from my finger and laid it on the desk. The procession down the corridor continued. The walls on both sides of us were lined with narrow metal doors. Now the column of women halted. The matron was fitting a key into one of the doors. The door banged shut. The column moved on. Another door unlocked. Another human being closed behind it. No 2 from Harlem in the same cell. Betsy stepped through a door first. Before she could turn or say goodbye, it had closed. 2 cells farther on, Noli left me. Now the corridor branched and we turned left. Then right, then left again, an endless world of steel and concrete. 10 boom, Cornelia. Another door rasped open. The cell was deep and narrow, scarcely wider than the door. A woman lay on the single cot, 3 others on straw ticks on the floor. Give this one the cot, the matron said. She's sick. A spasm of coughing seized my chest and throat. We don't want a sick woman in here, someone shouted. They were stumbling to their feet, backing away from me. I'm so sorry, I began, but another voice interrupted me. It isn't your fault. Come on, Frau Mikes, give her the cot. The young woman turned to me. "Let me hang up your hat and coat." Gratefully, I handed her my hat, which she added to a row of clothes hanging from hooks along one wall. I kept my coat wrapped tight around me. The cot had been vacated, and I moved shakily toward it, trying not to sneeze or breathe. I sank down on the narrow bed, then went into fresh coughing as a cloud of dust rose from the filthy straw mattress. At last, the attack passed and I lay down. The sour straw smell filled my nostrils. I will never be able to sleep on such a bed, I thought, and the next thing I knew it was morning and there was a clattering at the door. "Food call," my cellmates told me. I struggled to my feet. A square of metal had dropped open in the door, forming a small shelf. Onto this, someone in the hall was placing tin plates filled with a steaming gruel. "There's a new one here," Frau Mikes called out. "We get 5 portions." Another tin plate was slammed onto the shelf. I picked up my plate, stared at the watery gray porridge, and handed it silently to Frau Mikes to eat. In a little while the plates were collected and the pass-through in the door slammed shut. Later in the morning, a key grated in the lock, the bolt banged, and the door opened long enough for the sanitary bucket to be passed out. The wash basin was also emptied and returned with clean water. The women picked up their straw pallets from the floor and piled them in a corner, raising a fresh storm of dust that started me coughing again. Then a prison boredom, which I soon learned to fear above all else, settled over the cell. At first, I attempted to relieve it by talking with the others, but though they were as courteous as people can be who are living literally on top of one another, they turned aside my questions. I eventually realized that prisoners instinctively shied away from questions about their larger lives. For the first days of imprisonment, I stayed in a frenzy of anxiety about Father, Betsy, Willem, Pickwick. But these thoughts led to such despair that I learned not to give in to them. I was finding it hard to sit up. Increasingly, I was spending the days as I did the nights, tossing on the thin straw pallet, trying in vain to find a position in which my aches were eased. My head throbbed continually, pain shot up and down my arms, my cough brought up blood. I was thrashing feverishly on the cot one morning when the cell door opened and there stood a steel-voiced matron. "Ten boom, Cornelia." I struggled to my feet. "Come with me." My coat I was wearing already, but I took my hat from its hook and stepped out into the corridor. The matron relocked the door, then set off so rapidly that my heart hammered as I trotted after her. At last, we stepped out into the broad, high-walled courtyard. For the first time in 2 weeks, blue sky. How high the clouds were, how white and clean. "Quick," snapped the matron. I hurried to a shiny black automobile. She opened the rear door and I got in. 2 others were already in the back seat, a soldier and a woman with a gray face. Next to the driver slumped a desperately ill-looking man. As the car started up, the woman beside me lifted a blood-stained towel to her mouth and coughed into it. I understood. The 3 of us were ill. The massive prison gate opened, and we were in the outside world, spinning along broad city streets. I stared in wonderment through the window. People walking, looking in store windows, talking with friends. Had I been as free as that only 2 weeks ago? The car parked before an office building. We entered a waiting room jammed with people and sat down under the watchful eyes of the soldier. When nearly an hour had passed, I asked permission to use the lavatory. The soldier spoke to the trim white uniformed nurse behind the reception desk. "This way," she said crisply. She took me down a short hall, stepped into the bathroom with me, and shut the door. "Quick! Is there any way I can help?" I blinked at her. "Oh, yes. Could you get me a Bible? And a needle and thread, a toothbrush, and soap." She bit her lip doubtfully. "I'll do what I can." And she was gone. But her kindness shone in the little room as brightly as the gleaming white tiles and shiny faucets. My heart soared as I scrubbed the grime off my neck and face. A man's voice at the door. "Come on. You've been in there long enough." I rinsed off the soap and followed the soldier back to the waiting room. The nurse did not look up. After another long wait, my name was called. The doctor asked me to cough, took my temperature and blood pressure, applied his stethoscope, and announced that I had pleurisy. He wrote something on a sheet of paper. Then he laid a hand for an instant on my shoulder. "I hope," he said in a low voice, "that I am doing you a favor with this diagnosis." In the waiting room, the soldier was on his feet ready for me. As I crossed the room, the nurse rose briskly from her desk and swished past me. In my hand, I felt a small something wrapped in paper. I slid it into my coat pocket as I followed the soldier down the stairs. The other woman was already back in the car. The sick man did not reappear. All during the return ride, my hand strayed to the object in my pocket. The high walls loomed ahead, and then the gate rang shut behind us. At last, at the end of the long, echoing corridors, I reached my cell. My cellmates crowded around me as I unwrapped the package from my pocket. 2 bars of pre-war soap appeared. No toothbrush or needle, but a whole packet of safety pins. Most wonderful of all, in 4 small booklets, the 4 Gospels. I shared the soap and pins among the 5 of us. But though I offered to divide the books as well, they refused. I stretched my aching body on the foul straw and clutched the precious books between my hands. 2 evenings later, the cell door banged open and a guard strode in. "10 boom, Cornelia," she snapped. "Get your things." I said farewell to the others with my eyes and followed the woman into the hall. She paused to lock the door, then marched off down the corridor, heading deeper into the maze of prison passageways. She halted in front of a door and opened it with a key. I stepped inside. The door clanged behind me. The bolt slammed shut. The cell was identical to the one I had just left, 6 steps long, 2 wide, a single cot at the back. But this one was empty. As the guard's footsteps died away down the corridor, I leaned against the cold metal of the door. Alone. I must not let my thoughts run wildly. Sit down on the cot. This one reeked even worse than the other. I reached for the blanket. Someone had been sick on it. I thrust it away, but it was too late. I dashed for the bucket near the door and leaned weakly over it. At that moment, the light bulb in the ceiling went out. I groped back to the cot and huddled there in the dark, setting my teeth against the stink of the bedding, wrapping my coat tighter about me. The cell was bitter cold. What had I done to be separated from people this way? In the morning, my fever was worse. I could not stand even long enough to get my food from the shelf in the door, and after an hour or so the plate was taken away untouched. Toward evening, the pass-through dropped open again, and the hunk of coarse prison bread appeared. By now I was desperate for food, but less able to walk than ever. Whoever was in the hall must have seen the problem. A hand picked up the bread and hurled it toward me. It landed on the floor beside the cot. I clawed for it and gnawed it greedily. For several days while the fever raged, my supper was delivered in this manner. Mornings the door squealed open and a woman carried the plate of hot gruel to the cot. I was as starved for the sight of a human face as for the food and tried in a hoarse croak to start a conversation. But the woman, obviously a fellow prisoner, would only shake her head with a fearful glance toward the hall. The door also opened once a day to let in the trustee from medical supply with a dose of some yellow liquid from a very dirty bottle. This same trustee was also charged with recording my temperature each time. By the end of the week, an irritable voice called through the food slot, "Get up and get the food yourself. Your fever's gone. You won't be waited on again." I felt sure that the fever had not gone, but I would creep, trembling, to the door for my plate. When I had replaced it, I would lie down again on the smelly straw. Thoughts, now that I was alone, were a bigger problem than ever. I could not pray for family and friends by name, so great was the fear and longing wrapped around each one. "Those I love, Lord," I would say. "You know them. You see them. Oh, bless them all." Thoughts were enemies. That prison bag. How many times I opened it in my mind and pawed through all the things I had left behind: blouse, aspirin, a whole bottle of them, toothpaste with a peppermint taste, and then I would catch myself. If I had it to do again, would I put these little personal comforts ahead of human lives? Of course not. But in the dark, cold nights, as the fever pulsed, I would draw that bag out of some dark corner of my mind and root through it once again. A towel on this scratchy straw. An aspirin. This cell had a window. 7 iron bars ran across it, 4 bars up and down. It was much too high to look out of, but I could see the sky. All day I kept my eyes fixed on that bit of heaven. Sometimes clouds moved across the squares, white or pink or edged with gold, and when the wind was from the west I could hear the sea. Best of all, for nearly an hour each day, gradually lengthening as the spring sun rose higher, a shaft of checkered light streamed into the dark little room. As the weather turned warm and I grew stronger, I would stand up to catch the sunshine on my face and chest, moving along the wall with the moving light, climbing at last onto the cot to stand on tiptoe in the final rays. As my health returned, I read the Gospels, seeing whole the magnificent drama of salvation. And as I did, an incredible thought prickled the back of my neck. Was it possible that this war, Scheveningen prison, this very cell, none of it was unforeseen or accidental? Could it be part of the pattern first revealed in the Gospels? Had not Jesus, and here my reading became intent indeed, been defeated as utterly as our little group and our small plans had been? But if the Gospels were truly the pattern of God's activity, then defeat was only the beginning. I would look around at the bare little cell and wonder what conceivable victory could come from a place like this. A woman in the first cell had taught me to make a kind of knife by rubbing a corset stay against the rough cement floor. It seemed to me important not to lose track of time. So with a sharp honed stay, I scratched a calendar on the wall behind the cot. As each long day crawled to a close, I checked off another square. I also started a record of special dates beneath the calendar. February 28, 1944 arrest, February 29, 1944 transport to Scheveningen, March 16, 1944 beginning of solitary. And now a new date. April 15, 1944 my birthday in prison. 2 days after my birthday I was taken for the first time to the shower room. A grim-faced guard marched beside me, but nothing could dim the wonder of stepping into that wide corridor after so many weeks of close confinement. At the door to the shower room, several women were waiting. Even in the strict silence, this human closeness was joy and strength. I scanned the faces of those coming out, but neither Betsy nor Noli was there, nor anyone else from Haarlem. The shower was glorious, warm, clean water over my festering skin, streams of water through my matted hair. I went back to my cell with a new resolve. The next time I was permitted a shower, I would take with me 3 of my Gospels. Solitary was teaching me that it was not possible to be rich alone. I was not alone much longer. Into my solitary cell came a small, busy black ant. I had almost put my foot where he was one morning when I realized the honor being done me. I crouched down and admired the marvelous design of legs and body. I promised I would not so thoughtlessly stride about again. After a while, he disappeared through a crack in the floor. But when my evening piece of bread appeared on the door shelf, I scattered some crumbs, and to my joy, he popped out almost at once. He picked up a piece, struggled down the hole with it, and came back for more. It was the beginning of a relationship. Now, in addition to the daily visit of the sun, I had the company of this brave and handsome guest, soon of a whole small committee. If I was washing out clothes in the basin or sharpening the point on my homemade knife when the ants appeared, I stopped at once to give them my full attention. It would have been unthinkable to squander 2 activities on the same bit of time. One evening I heard shouts far down the corridor. They were answered closer by. Now noisy voices came from every direction. How unusual for the prisoners to be making a racket. Where were the guards? The shelf in my door had not been closed since the bread came 2 hours ago. I pressed my ear to it and listened, but it was hard to make sense of the tumult outside. The guards must all be away. Please, a voice pleaded. Let's use this time before they get back. What's happening? I cried through the open slot. Where are the guards? At the party, the same voice answered me. It's Hitler's birthday. People shouted their names down the corridor. This was our chance to tell where we were, to get information. I'm Corrie ten Boom. I called through the food shelf. My whole family is here somewhere. Has anyone seen Casper ten Boom? Betsy ten Boom? Noli van Werden? Willem ten Boom? I shouted names until I was hoarse and heard them repeated from mouth to mouth down the long corridor. I passed names, too, to the right and left as we worked out a kind of system. After a while, answers began to filter back. Along with personal messages were rumors about the world outside. At last, some of the names I had shouted out began to return. Betsy Ten Boom is in cell 312. She says to tell you that God is good. Oh, that was every inch Betsy. Then, Noli Van Werden was released more than a month ago. Released. Oh, thank God. Toos, too, released. News from the men's section was longer returning, but as it did my heart leaped higher and higher. Peter Van Werden. Released. Herman Slurring. Released. Willem Ten Boom. Released. As far as I could discover, every single one taken in the raid on the beach, with the exception of Betsy and me, had been freed. Only about Father could I discover no news at all, although I called his name over and over into the murmuring hall. No one seemed to have seen him. No one seemed to know. It was perhaps a week later that my cell door opened and a prison trustee tossed a package wrapped in brown paper onto the floor. I picked it up, hefted it, turned it over and over. The wrapping paper had been torn open and carelessly retied, but even through the disarray, I could spot Noli's loving touch. I sat on the cot and opened it. There, familiar and welcoming as a visit from home, was her light blue sweater. As I put it on, I seemed to feel Noli's arm circling my shoulders. Also inside the package were cookies and vitamins, needle and thread, and a bright red towel. How Noli understood the gray color hunger of prison. She had even wrapped the cookies in red cellophane. My eyes fell on the postage stamp. Hadn't a message once come to the beach under a stamp, penciled in the tiny square beneath? I moistened the paper in the basin water and worked the stamp gently free. There was definitely writing there, but so tiny I had to climb again onto the cot and hold the paper close to the bulb. All the watches in your closet are safe. Safe. Then they had gotten out of the secret room. They had escaped. They were free. How had they managed it? How had they got past the soldiers? Never mind. Dear Lord. You were there, and that is all that matters. The cell door opened to let in a German officer, followed by the head matron herself. My eyes ran hungrily over the well-pressed uniform with its rows of brilliant colored battle ribbons. Miss Ten Boom, the officer began in excellent Dutch, I have a few questions I believe you can help me with. The matron was carrying a small stool that she set down for the officer. The officer sat down, motioning me to take the cot. He took out a small notebook and began to read names from it. To my relief, I honestly did not know any of the names he read. Now I understood the wisdom of the name Mr. Smith. The officer stood up. Will you be feeling well enough to come for your hearing soon? Yes, I hope so. The officer stepped out into the hall, the matron scurrying after him with the stool. On the 3rd of May, I was sitting on my cot sewing. Since Noli's package had arrived, I had a wonderful new occupation. One by one, I was pulling the threads from the red towel and with them embroidering bright figures on the pajamas that I had only recently stopped wearing beneath my clothes. Suddenly, the food shelf in the door banged open and shut with a single motion. There on the floor lay a letter from home, the very first one. I unfolded the paper. Corrie, can you be very brave? I forced my eyes to read on. I have news that is very hard to write you. Father survived his arrest by only 10 days. He is now with the Lord. I stood with the paper between my hands so long that the daily shaft of sunlight entered the cell and fell upon it. Father. The letter glittered in the light as I read the rest. Noli had no details, not how or where he had died, not even where he was buried. Dear Jesus, I finally whispered, to think that Father sees you now, face to face. To think that he and Mama are together again. I pulled the cot from the wall and below the calendar scratched another date. March 9th, 1944, Father released.